Welcome to the Art of Storytelling. In this particular session, we'll actually film the videos in two separate sections and post it as two videos, so that way you can come back to them at any time. There's some exercises that I will encourage you to do as well along the way, and it would be really great if we could post a few of those onto the Meetup group site just to share a few ideas after the video as well. So originally I came to photography through art. I majored in painting in art school and art history and criticism. But my love of storytelling images came from a much deeper place than that alone. I've always been able to recall most of my dreams, and from a young age of around 5 or 6, I vividly remember my first reoccurring nightmare. I dreamt often that my family were in a hospital ward. It was dimly lit. My mum and dad and a doctor were standing in the corridor. The doctor was holding a silver platter in his hands. I pleaded with him, looking at my mum in utter confusion and disbelief, a little girl standing without any understanding of the events that led to this moment. My mum looks down at me with cold, angry eyes and she says, "There's just nothing that can be done now. It's too late." I scream and cry in pain. I can hear what she's saying, but I just can't understand. Her words seem distant and incomprehensible. Why? I just don't understand what's led to this moment. The doctor then hands her a razor blade, and with that she slits her wrist. Warm, rich blood seeps from her arm, and then she does something that I would just never forget. She reaches inside her wrist, her fingers fondling for the slimy vein, and she pulls hard. The motion is quick and decisive, and causes her head to fall clean off. It lands perfectly the right way up, gleaming bright on the silver platter. This was one of my first disturbing nightmares that I would have over the years. All so vivid, and many that I'd actually come back to a lot later on. I actually remember having this particular nightmare about my mum with the wrist and the silver platter, probably at least like a dozen times when I was a little kid. At that time, I never shared any of the images that my nightmares and my images that I would come up with any of the adults around me, mostly because I thought, well, they're going to think of them plain nuts to start with, but also because the images intrigued me and they really haunted me because they were images and dreams that I would come back to many times over. Lots of other different dreams I would have would be centered around sort of dark houses. It was always nighttime in my dreams. Dark houses that I would come back to time after time again, and you'd wake after the dream thinking, I just can't dream that again, please don't let me dream that again, and I would just go straight back into it the very next night. But houses that I can remember running through corridor after corridor, sort of houses that seemed to extend on forever, room after room that would be connected to each other, and yet I would always remember running through the house, being chased by who and by what, I don't really know. I guess that never really featured part of the dream. But I remember actually being able to run through these houses and even years later coming back to the same house in my dreams and knowing exactly where the secret passageways were, knowing exactly where the hidden little doors were and cupboards and things that would lead to secret rooms where I'd be safe. My brain, I concluded, was somewhat wired for weird and dark images and dark and vivid stories. And as I said, a lot of these I really didn't share till I was much older, sort of into my adult years before I spoke about them. After I finished art school, I became interested in art therapy and actually studied analytical psychology at UWS. Enter my love and obsession with Carl Jung. In Jung, I found exactly what I'd been looking for, a rational examination of my crazy images. I fast realized that I actually wasn't nuts. It was really just my brain tapping into the collective unconscious, the primordial images that we all have access to and that float around in our subconscious mind all the time. I fast realized that there was nothing crazy or nuts about what was going on for me while I was sleeping. Excuse me. I was just really a very visual person and very much hardwired for connecting into my own subconscious, really very much in tune with what my subconscious was trying to tell me, and realized very early on that my subconscious spoke a really visual language. I'd have dreams where I'd wake up the next day and sort of say to people, whoosh, I had another Twin Peaks dream last night. It was lots of very weird imagery that my brain would bring forward. So in my studies throughout analytical psychology, I was able to really kind of put words to the images and actually really start to find meaning and a story to the words that my subconscious was bringing forward. Interestingly enough, I actually Googled my strange dream about my mum in the hospital with the slitting of the wrist and the silver platter years later as an adult, and actually realised that I wasn't the only person in the world who ever actually had that dream as a kid. So there's something very archetypal with what was actually going on with those particular images. And it's interesting that I actually came across a group of people who had all actually dreamed that exact same dream about their own mother when they were children. So what I'd like you to take away from this workshop is a few simple things. I'd like to start to spark a train of thought in you about what kind of images that you want to achieve with your photography, and what kind of story do you have in you that you'd like to start to tell. I'd really love to give you a direction to start taking to experiment, and a direction that you can start creating a cohesive portfolio of images that kind of all work together to tell a similar story, rather than sort of being a mixed match portfolio of, you know, a bit of landscape, a bit of beauty, a bit of sort of child photography, a bit of people photography, going into weddings, really starting to get together a good portfolio that you can produce and to show people. Now, with this particular meetup group, the art of photography, when I started it, I wanted to start a meetup group that was really focusing on the art side. I really wanted to have a good focus on storytelling images rather than just portraits themselves. So for those of you who have been to the workshops before, you'll know that there's not so much a focus on the technique of the photo itself, not so much a focus on camera skills. Really the focus is on how to be creative, how to think outside the box, and getting you to start to think in a storytelling kind of a narrative way. So some of these images that you'll see here now were taken in earlier workshops from the end of last year. These two particular were taken in Mittagong on location. And you can see here that dreamlike sort of surreal quality that comes together in my own work. I can't seem to avoid it, unfortunately, but it's really the kind of images that I find really that I want to take. So this workshop isn't centered around branding and business building, but it actually forms quite an integral part of if you are thinking about starting a photography business, or even if you really are just trying to get together a really good sort of cohesive portfolio of photos. It's actually a really integral part of actually starting that process. So throughout this, you'll start to learn things like the why, the what, and the who of your photography. Why are you taking photos? What kind of photos do you want to take? And who is your target audience or client? I want you to really start to think about what kind of images you want to achieve. And so we're always going to start with that why. Why are you taking photos? So this is why I take photos. These are the reactions that I hope to elicit from the viewer when they look at my images. Now, photography today is in a really interesting place because it seems and it feels like everybody's a photographer. We are in such a visual culture at the moment, so everyone's timelines are bombarded with images, with photos. So we really want to make sure that our photos are standing out. Not just standing out, but standing out for the right reasons, to make sure that we're really actually getting the right reaction from the viewer. So these are my why. This is why I take photos. I want people to really stop and kind of go, oh, and look at the photos, really think about them. I want them to engage in them. I want to create images that they stop and consider. And most of all, I want to create art that people are curious about. I want them to really stop and look at the photo. I want them to have some recognition, that maybe there's something in them that sparks, something that reminds them of something that they've dreamt about or thought about. I want them to have a really good connection with the image themselves. I don't mind so much if it kind of elicits a strange reaction in people. I don't even mind if it kind of elicits a bit of a negative reaction. The point is I want them to react. I don't want them to be going through to their Facebook timeline or looking on Flickr and looking on, my website of images and having no reaction at all to the images. I much prefer them to have a really strong negative reaction than no reaction at all. So I really would like you to take a few minutes and to start to think about why you're taking photos. What kind of reactions do you want to get from people looking at your photos? Now, there's no right or wrong here, so if you've got a pen and paper handy, I'd really love you to grab that now, even if you have to pause the video for a minute to go grab it. And start to think about the kinds of reactions and the kinds of things you would like people to think about when they look at your photos. Now remember, this is something you can come back to at any time as well. It's something that may actually also evolve over time. But it's a really great sort of starting place to get you to thinking about having that really cohesive portfolio of images. So what I would like you to think about is what kind of story also do you have in me? So this is moving on from the why to the what and the who of your photography. With my own particular photography, most of my images are dark, they're vivid, they're dreamlike, they're surreal, they're archetypal, and they're deep. Most of my works are quite psychological. And the main thing I would like you to sort of think about here with what kind of stories you have in your photography, or what kind of stories would you like to start producing with your photography, is I really want you to think about this, because this is a really important step. As I said, we're not talking here in this session directly about branding as a photographer or marketing as a photographer, but these kinds of things to get you to start to think about play a huge role in that. To get a cohesive portfolio together to start a business, you really need to make sure that you are quite clear in why you're taking the photos, who you're taking the photos for, and once you start to think about your audience, who you're taking those photos for, that will really help you in starting to then, if you are looking at starting a photography business, designing your website, setting up your Facebook page, getting logos, business names, that sort of thing as well. The idea with getting the cohesive portfolio together is making sure that the story that you think that you're portraying in your images is actually the one you're portraying. Excuse me. You want to make sure that the story that you're telling matches everywhere. So when I say matches, I mean you need to have a website that reflects the same story. So my website needs to be dark, it needs to be surreal, it needs to reflect that same story that I'm telling, that very psychological, deep thinking story that I'm telling in the images. They need to be reflected in my website design, in my Facebook page, things like in social media, in tweets that I put out, in anything that I'm putting forward. I need to make sure that the story completely matches together. And the other thing that you need to start to think about is how you're actually selling yourself as a photographer. It's your branding in your own person as well. So you need to get to a place where people actually start to instantly recognize your style, instantly recognize that's a very Simone image. I actually hear people say that all the time. Or I'll do a particular pose in a workshop and I'll hear someone go, that's a really you kind of a pose. That's the kind of thing. You need to start to get that whole story running right throughout everything you're doing with your photography. Now, obviously here, this is something that you need to work on and develop over time. So I'd like you to start to think about and write down again for a minute what kind of story you have in you, what kind of photos, and maybe who your photos are directed towards. Because this is a really big part when you're starting to think about getting that portfolio together. So take a few minutes, write a few words down. Your words may well be completely different to my words. Your story may be totally different to mine, and I hope it is. I want you to start to think about what kind of photos you want to take, what kind of photographer you want to be. So take a few seconds and write those down. And again, these are the kinds of things I'd love to share on the meetup page. There's no right or wrong. Just start with whatever comes out, and you can always come back to this at another time. So you can pause the video here if you'd like a little bit more time to work on that now, or we can continue on and you can come back to that later. So start with and work on your keywords. And these might be something that you may come back to in the next few weeks or even the next couple of months to really sort of develop them fully. Once you're happy with your keywords, use those to guide your style of your website, your Facebook page, the kind of posts that you put out all the time, your business logos, your business name. You want to create a clear and cohesive brand for your photography. And just to touch on things like social media and Facebook again for a moment, I even tend to keep my posts that I put out on social media along the same lines. For example, because my work is surreal and it is dreamlike and it's psychological, I would never post something on my Facebook page that was cute or flowery or floral or something that completely flies in the face of the story that I've got running. I try not to in my Facebook page. I keep it about the art. I keep it about photography. I don't ever post anything that's political. I'm not the kind of photographer that would ever post on and comment on something, that's kind of a very topical political situation or a social situation at the moment. My particular photography page, I really want to keep that clear story together. So I like when I post things on my photography page, if I'm doing an image, I always post a little story or text or a bit of poetry or something that goes with it. But I always make sure that the text or the poetry or the story match completely with what I'm actually posting. So if I'm going to post anything, right, whether it's an image or a comment, it's all going to be nice and cohesive. So we've got that constant stream going right the way through of that same story. So my style of images is actually less commercial. For me, my audience is gallery owners, art lovers, art buyers. I have some of my images for sale on Stocksy and Etsy and a couple of different websites. A lot of them I sort of put forward to sell as cover art books. That's a big area that I'm developing at the moment. And so that all goes hand in hand with my story, my niche market. My kind of images are not images that sell to family portraits. Although you're welcome to book a family portrait, you too can have your child on top of a coffin. But it's really important to keep that clear story running, even when you're starting to think about the kind of people that may be interested in buying your photography as well. Now, even if you're thinking, well, I'm not looking to start a business, I'm just in this for a hobby, that's great. But what kind of art do you want around your house? What kind of style do you have at home? You need to make sure that the style of photos you're taking is the kind of thing that you want to display on your own walls at home. So even if you're not looking to start a business, it's really good still to have that cohesiveness across your style and still have it even within your own home, something that matches and goes right throughout rather than being all over the place. So the two exercises I'd like you to go back over now or at a later time is looking at your own keywords. Why are you taking the photos? What kind of story do you have? And who are the photos for? So always go back and start with your why. So the kind of reactions that I like to elicit from my viewer were things that were engaging, that making them stop and consider my photos and really be quite curious about the images and really thinking about what my story may well be about. So now we move on to constructing a story. When I start to think about creating an image, and I do find that starting point is always the worst place, whether you're painting a picture, doing a drawing, or taking a photo, the minute you start to step away from just a basic portrait and you're starting to think about creating a story, the most horrible point to be at is at that blank canvas stage. And we all do it, even myself. I can be going into a shoot and I've got my rough ideas of what I want to do, but you just can't quite see it come together at that point. Other times I'll have the image pop straight into mind and I know exactly the image that I want to create. So I want to show you some simple basic steps you can do throughout this workshop to starting to get away from that blank canvas and to, some simple things that you can do that will help you in starting to move away from a portrait to actually creating a piece of art with a story through it. Now this is a really simple exercise, and again this is something that you can definitely come back to many times over. And after doing this session last time with the meetup group, there's actually one more here I'm going to add on to the list that you can pop on there too. A really simple technique with creating a story is using these, 5 here, but I'm going to add a 6th one in. These 5 different sort of basic little things to start to nut out a story from a blank canvas for you. So this is an exercise like the last workshop when we hosted this particular art of storytelling. I got people to write down again. So I'd like you to take a few seconds and write these words down, because these are going to really help you out when you're starting to plan your own photo shoots and when you're starting to plan taking your own images and making your own art. Now these are things that you can just quickly brainstorm and then go back and sort of fill in later. And again, these are the kinds of things that I'll put some examples on the meetup site. And I encourage you to be brave and post some of your little stories on the meetup site too. So what I want you to do is start to think about the character of your image. Is it male? Is it female? Are they old or are they young? And just jot down and just start to brainstorm. The next thing I want you to think about is the location of your image. You can start really simple. Is it indoors or outdoors? Is it at the beach, in the city, on a road, in a house? Is it on a farm, out in nature, in a forest? Just start with that really simple location. It may well be that you don't have a story in mind and the location may come a little later, but just see how you go. The next thing I want you to think about is the time of day. There's a couple of things for time actually. So you can look at, first of all, time of day. Is it daytime or is it nighttime? Is it early morning or is it early evening? The other thing you can look at here with time is you could also look at time of year. Is it winter, spring, summer, autumn? That sort of a thing too to help you shape your story. And the other thing you can think about with time is what time period of history is it in? Is it in the past? Is it in the present? Or is it in the future? Next, I want you to start thinking about any props that you may have that come to mind. You may have props at home that you'd like to use. Quite often I'll hear photographers say, look, I bought this really great clock, or I've got this amazing little bird cage, and I'd really like to create an image using that. So start to think about the kind of props that you have on hand, or a prop that you may need to source. And the 5th one there is colours. There may be a particular colour that jumps forward for you, that maybe you've got a particular colour that you always tend to use in your images. And the 6th one that was suggested by Cheryl, thank you very much, at our last session, was emotion. What kind of emotion are you going for in the image? Is it a sad image, a happy image? You can keep it really simple to start with. So just to give you a bit of an idea about constructing a story using these 5 or 6 prompts. An example would be things like character. I'm going to create an image with a young girl. She's probably in her early teens, and I see her as having flowing sort of brown hair. Her hair is out. The location I'm going to see her in, it's kind of like a farmland sort of a setting. I see her like in a rural property. And time-wise, I'm thinking it's early evening. So it's maybe just after the golden hour, just before it gets dark. The props I see her carrying, I think she's actually carrying, let's see, she's carrying a little bag this time round. It's not a basket, it's just a little bag that she's got with her. And I see some flowers in that little bag, just some flowers popping out the top, and they're red. But the emotion that I'm going to go for here is one of longing, one of concern. So I've got my young girl on my farmland, early evening with her bag full of flowers. I think I said red flowers. And I actually see her with a real sense of longing, a real sense of concern. So already here, just by using those few prompts, I'm starting to formulate a bit of an image in my mind. I'm actually starting to see a young girl on a farm who's actually leaving home. And I feel like now, as the image starts to sort of mull in my mind a bit, I'm thinking that she's really leaving home with a heavy heart. She's leaving home very much she's feeling the heaviness of that moment. And I almost see sort of that wind blowing, and I see the home in the distance on the farm. Maybe it's off to the right. And I'm actually seeing her kind of almost in pose-wise. She's carrying the bag with the props in her left hand, and I see her just turning her shoulders and her head looking back. And if you can imagine, it's just that moment in a story where the heroine's left, she's left her home, and it's one final glance back at the home itself. So as you can see, just even using those real basics, now all of a sudden we've got kind of a meatier, kind of a chunky story and image that we can start to produce. And it also just gives us a starting point, rather than looking at a blank canvas, which I know is really the time that really kind of is difficult for people, that getting started. They may, as I said, have one or two of these ideas already thought about. They already know that they want to take a photo on a cliff top using a lantern or a candle. The rest of the story is a little bit sketchy. So this is a really great sort of exercise that you can come back to over and over again, even if whether you've got some of these already in mind, some props and location worked out, but you need to get the story fuller, or whether you're completely from scratch with no idea, but you know you want to go out and take a photo this weekend. What am I going to shoot? Take a little while, make a cup of coffee, make a cup of tea, sit down somewhere quiet, and just really start to brainstorm out some ideas. Use this technique, over and over again, and you'll start to see how simply and quickly the ideas flow. So take a few minutes now, and as I said, I'll encourage people to put some of these things onto the Meetup site, and who knows, maybe we'll even start to photograph some of these ideas. Maybe you've got an idea that's been sort of mulling around for a while and just needed a bit of clarification, and this might be just the thing that you needed to really refine the story and get it away from being a portrait to a story. So take a few minutes. You can pause the video if you like, or come back to it later, and just start to jot down something that instantly comes to mind for you. Just jot down straight away a character that pops into your head. Now jot down a location. Now start to think about a time. Think about some props that you may see around the character. Maybe some colour steps forward. And then also start to think about the kind of emotion in the story. Is it happy? Is it sad? And so what I'll do is I'll post a couple of these on the Meetup site as well. There's two ways of doing this. There's a shortened version, which you're just doing a brainstorming point form. And then what I like to do is go back into it and really pad out the story. So rather than just taking it from our point form, from my story example before of my young girl on the farmland, early evening with her red flowers and bag, and her sense of longing, take it one step further. So that's just a really brief way of sort of brainstorming the points. Now develop the story further. So I see this young girl as having to leave home not because she's been forced out of the home, but out of a sense of duty. I can kind of see that she feels like she's protecting her family, and maybe she's actually doing them a favour by leaving home. It's a really beautiful, warm and loving family, and there's a lot of love there. So when she's leaving home, it's with a really heavy heart. So start to go really into the story and start to really a little bit get into the mind of the character. This will give us a bit of an idea of what kind of poses she's going to be doing. She's not doing very fast walking away from the house. She's not doing very strong poses. They're kind of very soft poses. She's walking with purpose and determination, but it's with sadness. It's not with anger or strength. So that will give me the kind of ideas of what she's actually doing. Just start to really pad the story out a little bit. Start to think about why she's leaving. Start to actually spend some time actually writing these kinds of things out. And the process will get easier and easier each time you do it. The other way that we can go about creating a story is deconstructing an existing story. Now, this is something that we've been doing throughout the workshops with the Dark Fairy Tales, and also in the meetup group coming up where we've got our Dark Adventure series with Van Helsing and Dorian Gray. Now, when we're deconstructing a story that already exists, there's two ways we can go about that. We can take the original story and simply recreate it, or we can take it off in another direction altogether where you get to choose a slightly different ending. A good example of this was with the Princess and the Pea workshop we did a few weeks ago. And with that one, a lot of the images ended up going in a much sort of more feminine, stronger role, rather than her having the pea there and finding the pea as a sense of, having that prince that's going to save her now that the prince has recognized that she's the one. We actually ended up doing a lot of story building around the idea of, well, what if she doesn't need the prince? What if she decides that, what if the pea itself is actually symbolic of not finding the prince or the princess, but what if the pea was actually symbolic of her finding herself? And so from there we created new images, taking the story ending in a slightly different direction. So again, it's sometimes a lot easier, in some ways a lot more difficult to do when you're deconstructing an existing story. So first of all, we have our story. Now with the fairy tales and the dark adventures we've been doing, we're not taking the Disney version of the fairy tales. We are going to the much older versions of how they were originally written, which were naturally a lot darker and a lot more psychological and deeper by nature. We're taking the main character from the story, and we're actually going to grab these aspects of the story that interest us most. Now, we may not be able to photograph the entire fairy tale, but what part of the fairy tale is interesting to you? And then we're going to create a new journey for that character. Now, for example, next week we have coming up the Snow White fairy tale shoot. Now, in that, obviously, the story that we've got is an existing one that everybody knows really well. The character that I'm thinking of pulling out from that particular story is actually kind of like a younger version of the Wicked Queen. What happened to her just prior to being the Wicked Queen herself? What was it that led her to be who she was, to do the things that she did? And that's the aspect of the story that interests me. It's kind of like that moment just before. And we're going to create a new journey with that. So yes, I'll definitely be looking at taking the story in a new direction. Maybe we'll be resolving some things for the Wicked Queen herself. Or maybe we'll be going down that traditional path. Who knows? The images will be up next weekend. So now that you have your story, the why you're taking photos, the what you're taking photos of, and who you're taking photos for, you can start to have fun with constructing new stories of your own or deconstructing existing stories. So I'd like to just recap the couple of exercises I'd like you to do and start to think about. The first one was looking at why you're taking the photos and what kind of reaction you'd like to elicit from your viewers. What kind of story you'd like to tell. And then I'd like you to have a bit of a go at the constructing of a story, using those 5 to 6 points: the character, the location, the time, the props, the colours, and the emotion. So we'll stop the first part of the video series here. I'll let you have a bit of a think about what we've talked about so far, And then we'll go on to, we're actually going to do a bit of a behind the scenes in the next section of how to plan for a series, plan for a photo. And I'm going to do something a little bit out there. I'm going to start to think about, and I'm in the next part of the video, I'm actually going to start to look at the Van Helsing Dark Adventure series that we've got coming up. That one's going to be shot on location. It's going to be shot sort of early evening, which is my favourite time to shoot, between, I think it's 3 and 5 p.m. And that's actually going to be shot on a really wonderful rocky outcrop, the south end of Coogee Beach.